evening, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Let's Talk About It. This is Susan Johnson, and I'm here today without my co-host, Dennis O'Brien, who is out doing great things this afternoon, and he'll be back for another show very shortly. But we do have a wonderful guest for everybody tonight. We have our Secretary of the State, Stephanie Thomas, and she's here to talk about her work and how she got to be the Secretary of the State. So I want to welcome you very much to the show, Stephanie.
Thank you, Susan. Happy to be here, finally. We've been talking about this for a while.
Yes, we have. I remember when you first got elected and we were serving in the House of Representatives together. And I said, hey, Stephanie, I think it would be great to have you come out to Windham and come on the Let's Talk About It show and tell us all about your district. So why don't we start there and just talk a little bit about when you were the state representative for your district and what towns did you represent?
Sure. I was covering the 143rd District, which are parts of Norwalk, Wilton, and Westport. So way downstate.
The other side of the Connecticut River, and maybe some others that I'm not aware of. But anyway.
Exactly.
Yeah, and so, but then the Secretary of State position became open, and you decided to go for it. And I was very impressed, by the way, with the way you spoke on the floor of the House, and you really had a lot of great impact when you were in the House, but you were there a short time.
Yeah, absolutely. I was only there one term, so 2 years. And when Secretary Merrill decided not to run for re-election, I thought this job sounds like an ideal fit for me because I'm a business owner and the Secretary's office deals with business formations. And I also care deeply about civic literacy and democracy and voting and voter access. So I decided to run, and here I am.
Wonderful. You ran, and my goodness, you were able to do that statewide, which is a huge amount of work. And so you are a business owner. What kind of a business?
I run, I'm closing, in the process of closing it now because I have another full-time job. But for 10 years, I've owned a fundraising consulting company that works with nonprofits on fundraising projects. So it's headquartered in New York City. We were working with about 30 nonprofit charities every year, raising usually up to about $20 million.
Oh, well, I'd say that's a good amount of money.
Yeah, a lot of money to help good causes.
Well, that's right. I mean, the nonprofits are doing amazing work. A lot of the nonprofits, of course, were once state organizations, and they were privatized into the nonprofit sector. And I think a lot of people don't realize that.
And I think a lot of people don't realize often if government isn't able to completely solve a problem, nonprofits are usually there forming to pick up the pieces, so to speak. So I always used to say, like, no one wants to see our society without the nonprofit sector.
Well, that's so true. Because that's what the government does, and that's what the nonprofits do. They fill in the things that the business community can't do, really. I mean, the business community is there to make a profit, and the nonprofits and the government are there to do the things that the business community can't do.
Absolutely.
And so tell me about what first, I know Secretary of the State Merrill said she wasn't going to run again. And, of course, we want to just give her high praise, great accolades for the amazing work she did.
100%.
Just amazing.
Great work through the pandemic in particular.
Yeah, and also for the way that we were able to finally get our Constitution amended for early voting. But we'll get on to that in a couple. I just want to get into some more of the things that you went through when you were running for the Secretary of the State to get to the finish line and to make it here. Not that you couldn't have come anyway, but but tell us a little about the campaign and how that was, because I know running statewide. I mean, I run just townwide, and it's just an amazing thing to me. But to run statewide is wow.
I won't lie, it was a challenge, so it helps to be committed, right? Most people don't realize, so I served 2 years in the State House, and now I'm Secretary of the State. That is my political experience. So It was definitely more challenging because I didn't have deep relationships with, all the key stakeholders, town to town. So I had to do it the old fashioned way. I think during the campaign, I visited about 125 towns. At least once, some of them many more times than once. We put about 13,000 miles on the car.
It's
So
good. All good.
just walking around, going around, introducing myself and answering questions. And that's what I did for over a year. And apparently it paid off.
I guess so. Well, I guess that's really the what you have to do. You're right. You really have to be committed. And I just have to say how much I appreciate the fact that you were here for the Wyndham Hospital nurses. You were here for that, for supporting them, and when they were on strike and when they were trying to get a contract, you came out and you supported the nurses.
I was here,
Yeah, which was a really good thing. I think the nurses, I'm sure appreciated that, and I think maybe that goes back to some of your ideas in terms of how nonprofits work, how we serve the public.
Yeah, absolutely. I have always been about people and helping people. So maybe it's public service, and that's what I felt I was doing in the nonprofit sector by raising money. And it wasn't until much more recently that I realized that government is serving in that same role, but you're just helping at a different point in the process. So for me, listening to people's stories, telling people my own story, and really engaging at that person-to-person level is really important to me, and I think it's important to voters.
Absolutely. So a little bit of what we haven't hit on about your own story. Tell us.
Sure. Oh gosh, well, how much time do you have, Susan? No. So I'll give you my campaign speech because it sums it up in about 2 minutes, 1 minute. Let's see. I grew up poor in an affluent town, which meant I had excellent public school education, but I often did my homework by candlelight because we had no electricity. Worked hard, went to NYU, I got a partial scholarship, worked my way through. My first job was in the nonprofit sector as a fundraiser. And I decided early on that I found value in doing that work versus just enhancing shareholder value, say. So I got my master's in nonprofit management because I thought I'd open a nonprofit one day. But instead, while I was in graduate school, I got an internship for a consulting company. I worked my way up over a couple of decades to be company president. I ran that company for a little bit, and then eventually I opened my own company, and that's what I was doing. So let's see, the 2016 presidential election happened, and I decided to get more involved in my town. And that's when I realized how much happens in the governmental sector and how small a voice I felt that I had in it. And the more I paid attention, I didn't like the way my state rep was voting. So I was very audacious. I decided with no experience, no information, and very late in the process to run for that seat because no one had challenged her for several elections. And I thought, that's just not even a democracy. Like, people should have choice. So I petitioned my way onto the ballot. I ran in 2018. I lost, but only by a few hundred votes. And then, believe it or not, I thought, I'm never going to run again. I'm going to go back to my company and keep doing what I do. But one bill that I talked about throughout my entire 2018 campaign was the early voting bill. And I thought, we have a Democratic trifecta. What else do we need? It's going to get passed and it'll all be wonderful. And it didn't. And that bothered me. So I literally said to myself, well, I guess I have to get up there and see what's happening. So I ran again in 2020. I won, and the rest is history.
All right. Well, thank you for that update. I appreciate it. That's great. Good to know. And good to know about your passion because it aligns very well with former Secretary of the State, Denise Merrills, because we had proposed early voting back, I think it was 2010. And
it's been a long time coming.
Well, we proposed it. and as you know, the Constitution requires if you don't get a 3/4 majority, you got to go back and do the same thing over.
Yep.
So we did. We got it done. It went on the ballot, and it didn't pass. The people here in Connecticut didn't pass it the first time.
In 2014, but I really think it was a matter of two things. One, lack of any sort of public education campaign about ballot measures. The reason I know that, I moved to Connecticut in 2013, so 2014 was sort of my first real election or big election, and I remember doing research, like wondering, would there be a ballot question? Who's on the ballot? And I couldn't find anything. And this was the first state I had lived in where I wasn't mailed a voter guide that told you about all these issues. So I got to the polls. Lo and behold, there was the question. It was about no excuse absentee voting and early voting combined. And guess what I did, Susan?
You voted for
I left it blank. Because I read it and I had no idea what they were talking about.
Oh, my.
And I consider myself an educated person, and I did not want to vote on something that I hadn't had time to research and consider the pros and cons. So I left it blank, and a lot of other people did as well.
Yes, they did. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's been a long, long period of time. And then when a lot of states don't have a constitutional amendment that addresses how we vote.
Correct.
And so in some ways I say that's good, in other ways it's bad. The states that aren't required to do the voting by the Constitution, they can just change things by statute depending on how the legislature feels at that particular cycle. And so you can really create a situation where you don't have that kind of stability that we have. And I think we have in terms of getting the information out. So it's just not okay, we're going to do it now because the legislature said so. It is something that the Constitution requires us to think about, to make sure we really want to do it. So I think that when you take a look at how these things are in the Constitution, I always, as a lawyer, say, hey, be careful of what you want to amend the Constitution for, because if you want to change the amendment, it's going to take you some time. But on the other side of the coin, it also creates stability.
And, it is what it is. And I think it's fair that I actually prefer that it had to go to the voters for a decision. I just wish, as part of the process, there was education built in. But we saw that with the efforts of public education, there were a lot of groups from AARP, who seniors, by the way, really need early voting or enjoy it when you look around the country. Groups like the ACLU, groups like Common Cause, League of Women Voters, they did do a public education campaign. Former Secretary Merrill did as well.
Yes.
And we saw that when people were educated about what they were voting on, it passed with over 60.2% of the vote.
Yeah, but also they did it on the heels of COVID, which also made people really, they were home more, so they got to read more. And they also said, hey, I want to be able to vote by absentee or have early voting, so I don't have to be in a crowd. If I'm an older person, I might be subjected to some type of illness if I'm in close quarters with somebody who is maybe not wearing a mask, maybe is ill, maybe doesn't know they're ill.
I think COVID was the public education campaign because people learned, oh wait, people all around the country do many other things other than going to the polls on election day. And I don't think Connecticut residents had really thought about that en masse. We're hardly an outlier. The first state passed, Texas was the first state with early voting back in the 1980s.
Okay.
We are now...
Along with all the gerrymandering that they did in the 1980s, too, just want to say.
But what I'm saying is this is a reform that has been around for decades, and we are one of the last 4 states to just be getting to that point.
And
So-
I don't know what Texas's form of government was in terms of they could do it by statute, I would
Yeah.
suspect.
I believe there's only one other state that had the constitutional requirement.
And of course, we have our own details on how to make that amendment as well.
Yeah.
So I think that is something that a lot of people said, well, what about Connecticut? What are you doing? And making sure, you can't, all these other conservative states but I said, hey.
We're old. A lot of our details are baked into our Constitution.
And like I say, some of those things need to be statutory.
Yeah.
And I think that we've done a good job with that. And now we want to do a no excuse absentee ballot voting.
We do. So, as you know, and thank you for that vote, that passed with pretty widespread bipartisan support. No excuse absentee voting will now go to the public in the 2024 election for them to consider if they would like us to adopt it or consider it.
Explain that too, would you please? Because that is something I don't think people fully get. That we have standards in the Constitution for which you have to meet in order to be able to get that application
Sure.
for an absentee ballot to be sent to your house. In the state of Connecticut, you just don't get a ballot. You have to apply for it, and you have to be a registered voter. So I want to make sure people hear that loud and clear.
Yes, and you have just explained it, so I'll reiterate it.
Please go ahead. You can't say it enough.
And I think a lot of people are moving away from this term "no excuse" because it seems confusing. Some people call it universal voting. Some people call it no reason. So many states, I believe all but 11 now, or maybe 8, have some form of what we have been calling no excuse absentee voting. It is no different than our current process. For example, states can decide how they want to implement it. Some states have moved to all mail, meaning they mail everybody either the ballot or the application, but Connecticut has never done that. We have an application system, and I would expect that to continue, where if someone wants an absentee ballot, they make that request, their town clerk checks their information to make sure it's a valid voter, and then sends them the ballot. So if they don't meet any of those thresholds, they don't get an absentee ballot.
And now that you mentioned a valid voter, what constitutes a valid voter?
Oh my gosh. I mean, I feel like that's a broad question, but a simple question.
No, what's on the form?
Yeah.
What do you have to fill out in the form?
Well, you have to be a registered voter.
Well, no, I mean,
so
how do you
have to
register?
be
I guess how do you vote? How do you register to vote?
You can register either online if you have a driver's license, a Connecticut driver's license, because they already have a lot of the information that proved your citizenship. Otherwise, you fill out a voter registration form, hard copy, but same thing. You have to be a United States citizen, obviously. You have to provide some information like your social security number, if you don't have a driver's license number, details like that, so your identity is verified.
Mm-hmm. Very good. I just want to make sure because sometimes there's confusion about that. And we do have our voter registration cards, I know, in Spanish and English. Are there any other ways?
Just those two languages. But I think what the confusion is about usually is about who is on the list. And I don't think most people realize there are federal laws that mandate when someone can be removed from a list. So, for example, say I get word Susan Johnson no longer lives in Connecticut, and I get that information. If you didn't say that yourself by writing to your registrar, they then...
Who does?
No one does this. And this is exactly the point. So please, if anyone is listening, when you move, please alert your registrar of voters. This would solve so many problems. But anyway, so you have now moved off to Wyoming. I don't know why, but you have. And your neighbor told me that's not good enough. So the registrar now has to try to reach you. And they can't just try once. So if it's not confirmed, so anyway, there are federal requirements with how many attempts have to be made. So there are many people on the list who are coded as inactive, but they're still on the list. And that's where I think people get confused. Like, why is this person on the list? They haven't lived there. They're on the list because there are federal laws.
Okay, well, that's something I was unaware of.
Yeah.
So thank you for that. We're going to take a little break here. I'm here with our Secretary of the State, Stephanie Thomas, and we want to have our sponsors get a chance to say hi to everybody, and we will be right back after these messages. Welcome back, everyone. This is Susan Johnson, and I am here this evening with our very, very special guest, Secretary of the State, Stephanie Thomas, and we are talking about all the things that you have to do in order to be a registered voter and all the checks and balances that occur on the local level, on the state level, and on the federal level. I just learned something new about the
National Change of Address List
through the post office. And so this is one way that the voters list can be updated after 2 cycles of federal elections that people fail to vote in. So that's a very, very interesting thing to know. And now let's take a little bit of talk about when will we actually begin the early voting?
Good question. So the bill that passed calls for the first election in 2024, which is the presidential preference primary in April.
Wow.
And I'm sure you recall since you got to vote on it. So the PPP, as it's called, will include 4 days of early voting.
Okay.
But when we move to the fall, the August primary, or the general election in November, the primary will have 7 days and the general will have 14 days.
Yeah, I remember especially the 14 days.
Yes.
So that's where we are now. And I know that the municipalities have received some funding, but I'm not sure where we are with if they're fully satisfied.
So some funding was passed for the 2024 fiscal year, which covers the PPP election. Each town received will receive $10,500 regardless of size. So they are not satisfied because whether you're Union or Stamford, you got the exact same amount of money. And nothing has been discussed yet for the next fiscal year, which will include the presidential election and the August primary, where Senator Murphy is on the ballot and whoever else is involved in that race. So these tend to be high turnout elections. And right now, there's zero money allocated. So I know our office will certainly be requesting a mid-year adjustment when the legislature reconvenes in 2024, and I am hopeful that dollars are passed to help towns defray the cost, because for the general election, a presidential election, with the bill that passed, we're talking each town over 180 hours of early voting. So it's not cheap, and it's not a small effort.
No, 180 hours is quite a bit.
It is quite a bit.
Yeah, especially if you're a small town.
I might note that I advocated for a smaller window, but
I think many people did. I don't think that you were the only one. I'm not sure why we went to 14, but I think a lot of people wanted it, and so
I think it's one of those things. I will say the average across the country is actually 18 days.
Really?
And some states are doing 30 days. So I think if you're not tasked with implementation, right, it sounds reasonable, and it is reasonable, but it also will require quite a price tag, because we need high-level poll workers. We need to recruit many more poll workers to cover those hours, and we'll be doing it for the first time. So I'm hoping the state will provide a little bit of a safety net by defraying some of those costs for the towns until we learn a little more.
Yeah. What? And in terms of, now we talked a little bit about the districts and the towns, and so one of the things that we did discuss on the floor was the fact that it doesn't necessarily have to be the early voting place. It doesn't necessarily have to be in the town hall or a voting place. It could be in a regular place that people go to on a regular basis, like a library.
Maybe. Most people are doing it in their town hall.
Okay.
There will be some requirements. We are in the process of writing a handbook, so to speak.
Great.
So the main thing that will have to be at the early voting site is access to the Central Voter Registration System, CVRS. Um, uh, so every town, or probably 99.9% of the towns, have that at their town hall. So if there is another location, hard lines will have to be run and a new system set up in that location. And some money was passed to help towns defray that cost, but it wouldn't be enough for every town to do that.
What about the equipment? I've heard a lot about the equipment and how we are having to upgrade our voting equipment.
So, there's a lot of equipment that comes into play. While we're talking about CVRS, what most people don't realize, right now there's no capacity to track if someone early voted. So we have to build out a new CVRS system, which happily we had already started. And I won't get into too many details, but our new system, which will be fabulous, will be ready by the end of June, and we're cobbling together another new system to overlay on our current system that will be ready for the PPP election. And already people's eyes start to glaze over when I talk
The
about
presidential primary election,
Yes.
that is the
Thank you.
PPP. It's not the...
Not the Paycheck Protection Program.
Thank you.
Yeah, exactly. I know. As a business owner, that's what I think.
That's exactly what
But-
came to mind after COVID, yeah. But we're talking about
Our
the Penn
what was the
presidential
other thing?
primary election.
Personal protection.
Oh, that personal protection, yes.
Yeah.
the-
A lot of PPPs around.
yes, there are. Well, I guess there must be. Yes.
I feel like there's a joke in there somewhere.
There is,
but
we're
anyway,
gonna go right
I'm
by
not
it.
going to go there. So the other equipment, not related to early voting, but just related to our elections, are tabulators. So anyone who's been around long enough remembers we used to have these great lever machines,
Well, I'm
which
that
I
old.
loved actually. With
I
the
am that
curtains.
old, yeah. And I remember my mother brought me in to vote when I was a little person.
Yes,
And
yes.
always bring your child to vote.
Yes,
So,
absolutely. We have some of those old machines at our office, so you can come by and reminisce at any
Oh,
time.
thank you, yes.
But we switched to optical scanners, which when we switched, we were also not exactly one of the first states to do so. So the federal government became so concerned about states' voting apparatus that they funded equipment. So that is when Connecticut purchased its last equipment, when we got that federal funding. So we bought some in 2007 and 2008. And the way, I think one of my favorite registrars explained it this way. Like, if you have an old car, it still drives, but it's not going to match all the features and safety features of a new machine, a new car. So the same is true. If anyone recalls headlines from last August, some of the roller wheels were melting because it was so hot during the August primary.
Oh, boy.
I know my first election, I didn't get my results election night because when it rains and the ballots get any kind of dampness, like imagine your sleeve drops some water, it doesn't always feed through, so it has to go to a manual count.
It's like a printer wouldn't feed through if you had a
exactly.
sticky piece of paper. in your
And
printer.
what most people don't realize, we have to feed our ballots that are voted by absentee through those machines one by one. So Stamford, for example, in 2020 had 30,000 absentee ballots. So imagine that now, feeding through a cranky machine one by one. And people wonder why they don't get election results like on election night so quickly. So we need new equipment.
And we're getting it. It's all in the process, or how is that working?
It was approved by the legislature,
Yep,
the bonding
yep,
committee.
yep,
So
yep,
as you know, it still needs to be placed on the bonding commission agenda and then voted upon to release the actual money. It was not on the last meeting's agenda. I remain hopeful that one day, very soon, makes its way onto the agenda. Otherwise, we won't have enough time to implement before the presidential election, which is the goal because of volume.
Right. Yes, the volume and of course the machines are always something that we back and when the Bush versus Gore election, and we had the Help America Vote Act, and we finally got our first scanning machines.
Yep, yep.
But our scanning machines have always been not connected to the internet.
Yeah, they never have
And
been.
we've always had a paper trail here.
Yes, yes.
So this
Connecticut's great. Many states, when they got their scanners, they were the type that connected to the internet. Connecticut has never done that. I suspect we never will do that.
I certainly hope not.
Certainly not under my administration.
Yes.
And now Homeland Security is very busy trying to make sure the other states are no longer doing that, and saying that a paper ballot and having that audit trail is best in class.
I remember when that happened, and I was going around with some other lawyers to some of the voting places just to make sure there was no difficulty, no question. And I went through the Help America Vote training just as a lawyer, just to be there for people who might run into difficulty. And that was a big education. But because of that training, Susan, now Lieutenant Governor Bysowitz, was the Secretary of State then, and she said, "What do you think?" And so all of us who were the HAVA people would say, "Hey, you're going to have a paper trail, and you can't connect to the internet." And that's exactly what she did. She was
great.
right spot on, and it's been maintained that way all the way through.
Yep.
And it's really a good thing, and it makes it when you go to the well, here we only have 25,000 people. So when you go over to Stamford or south, when you go to the southern part of our state, you have a much more densely populated area, and you have a lot more to deal with in terms of making sure that you count the vote and it gets over to the clerk's office, so the clerk can go and work on the tally.
Exactly.
So that would be, and also count the absentee ballots that actually have come in.
Exactly.
So they have
a lot of work on election night.
Oh my God!
I think it's more than most people realize.
Yeah, if you go into the clerk's office after the election, which we do sometimes just to get the report on the absentee ballots, you find out they're really busy trying to get it done, and it's a very, very difficult
it's very
process.
difficult, requires obviously great attention to detail, and they've been at that point working a very long day and many hours in the month or two leading up to the election. So I always say thank a election worker, poll worker, registrar, town clerk, whenever you see them.
Do you see any opportunity where the absentee ballots can be counted, maybe have a little bit longer time to count them? Aside from
I will ask you. That is a legislative decision.
Are you proposing it?
That would have to be made. For the early voting bill, I did propose that they could start being opened and counted starting when the polls open on election day. I think at least giving that much time is helpful. I do believe if we adopted no excuse absentee voting and we expected to see large numbers, like a town like Stamford with 30,000, you have to provide more time. Otherwise, or you have to be comfortable not getting results
Only
for a couple of days.
Only 30,000?
Only, yeah, that's a lot.
Oh, we have 25 here.
No, 30 absentee ballots.
Oh, okay.
In and of themselves,
clear.
not to mention all the other.
Just 30,000 absentee
yeah.
ballots. Okay, thank you for the clarification.
Yes.
Yes.
A lot more voters.
That's what I thought. Very, very good. All right, so we want to just, we're running down a little bit, but so we're talking about the equipment. The bonding commission has that duty to try and bring that out so that you can get the equipment. And then, what do you think about municipal elections? So, what do you think that we have like a 21 to 32% turnout in municipal elections? We're coming up on a municipal election this cycle. Why do you think that is?
Honestly, I think it's about advertising and public education, and I would be remiss if I didn't say that, I think most people just assume the Secretary of the State's office is out there informing people how to register to vote, how to fill out an absentee ballot, and providing when the election's coming. But we're not, because we're not funded to do so. We receive some public education money with the ARPA dollars during the pandemic, and then the legislature did reappropriate that for the last biennium. But right now, we literally have $0 educated for any public education, whether it's in general, early voting, etc. So what that means in general is that I believe municipal turnout is so low because no one advertises it. During a presidential election, you cannot escape ads every day about all the people running. So it's top of mind. In the state rep years, etc., everyone is outdoor knocking. They're not advertising on television by and large, but there's a lot more activity. I know my district was about 20,000 people. I probably knocked 6,000 doors. And my opponent probably also knocked that many. So
but you also run with the governor or the president. As a
that's
state
true.
You're running every 2 years.
That's true. The governor.
So you know that there's an election coming on.
So there's just a lot more talk.
Yeah, and it's on TV.
On
and
television.
Where do people get their information?
So during a municipal year,
where do they get their
there's
information?
no television coverage. And as we all know, the local media is like disappearing.
Well, no, we're on WILI,
I
local
know.
radio station,
But
1400 or 95.3 on your radio dial.
And thank goodness.
And we stream.
But how many? But
got
how many
podcasts.
towns have this? I mean,
Thank you.
they
Yeah,
don't. They
that's right,
don't.
that's right.
I know. Even when I first moved to Norwalk, there were more local papers than there are now. So
Of course,
yeah.
they're being bought up and they're being monopolized.
So I just don't think the public has it top
They're
of
streaming,
mind.
right? They're streaming now. The public's streaming.
Yes.
So you're
yes,
not going to, unless
correct,
you go
correct.
for information on the government and elections,
You're not going to find it.
You're not going to find it in some type of a stream that you might be getting for music or a movie
it's
or a
so
show.
True. It's
And
not
so
on
we're-
TikTok.
Maybe.
I know, we are on TikTok, but I do think it's not top of mind. And then on top of that, I just think it's been for years we just always talk about national politics.
Yep.
People watch national news. So although their tax rate, their zoning laws, what their Board of Education is doing, these are things that touch everyone's lives locally. They think, oh, if I vote for the president, it will have an impact, or like
it will, but
not in the same way.
Not an immediate
and
impact.
I just don't
yes.
think they make that connection.
Yeah, I think it's partially more civics education, like you started to talk
yeah.
about, and we're running down to our last couple of minutes. I want
Okay.
you to say a few things about what we missed and a
Sure.
few things about where we're going.
Well, first and foremost, thank you for having me. And I do want to thank the legislature because this was the first year in a long time where many voter access bills were heard and passed with bipartisan support. So thank you. And civic literacy, this is my passion. I think there is a bit of an American myth out there that if you vote, everything somehow magically works out. But that's just not how the process works. You do have to vote, but then you also have to stay engaged for the other 364 days a year. You have to let your state rep know what you're thinking, what's important to you. When you are about to take a vote on something, it's helpful to hear from your constituents. You can't know every issue. You need that issue brought to you sometimes. So I just have been trying to prioritize teaching people about civic engagement and why it's important beyond just voting on election day. I could say a lot more about that. But
Well, I think that's a good start, and I think we're going to have you back. And I know that now you're in the groove, so you got to get back here on WYLI and tell us some more about how things are going with the municipals and how we're going to start off with the PPP presidential primary.
And can I
Yes,
give
please.
can I give one plug?
Sure.
Civics101.ct.gov. It's on our website. It's a great one sheet about the difference between municipal, state, and federal elections and what types of issues and positions relate to each. So read it.
All right, and that's going to be the next show, folks. All right. Thank you so much, Secretary of the State Stephanie Thomas. Thank you for being here. And we have another great show next week. So stay tuned on Let's Talk About It every Friday at 5.